Well, good morning, everyone. Oh, you all do this so much better than my class. My class kind of looks at me when I talk to them that way. I cannot stress how much of an honor it is to be back at UNC Chapel Hill. I give my colleagues at UVA a hard time about being the best public Ivy in the land. I am excited to be here to give this talk, to stand before the faculty members who mentored me, who helped me along in my research process, who led me to this very moment. Before I get started with that talk, though, being the first Black woman to do the Kilgour Lecture, it's an awesome responsibility, I do want to dedicate this talk to Maya Little, because I have been watching the events unfolding. As an alumna, I've been watching the events unfolding, and I was just so struck by how one Black woman in particular took action to do something that I did not do while I was here in my time, that so many people did not bother to do while they were here at UNC. But instead of walking past a statue every single day and just assuming that it was going to remain a part of the landscape, she took action. And so this talk is for Maya. All right. So if the news media headlines are to be believed, the fate of our republic rested squarely in the hands of Alabama voters on the second Tuesday in December of 2017. After sitting Alabama Senator Jeff Sessions was appointed and confirmed as U.S. Attorney General, his Senate seat was in play for the first time in 25 years. The race was characterized by coverage of events, real and imagined, that seemed to come directly from a television script. The GOP candidate accused of sexual misconduct against a teenager 40 years earlier. 1 year, 1 month, and 11 days after former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, yet lost the presidential election, progressives were looking to Alabama to send a message to Washington and to the rest of the country about their resolve. As with every election night, when the polls closed at 7 p.m., news coverage kicked into high gear, breaking down why, despite scandal and the influence of an increasingly unpopular president, and hinting that either candidate could win. Precinct results were reported on the hour, every hour, and in smaller increments where time permitted. Having learned from the presidential election that anything is possible in a post-Obama era, millions of Americans stayed up through the night watching to see how it would all turn out. I went to bed. I went to bed knowing that for all of the progressive fire and conservative ire that the presidential election had wrought in Alabama, if there were one group of voters who could be counted on to carry their interests, and with them, the interest of untold scores of disempowered groups into the voting booth, it would be Black women. And Black women delivered. The next day, Twitter was alight with the hashtag #BlackWomen as millions of users talked about the role they'd played in the Alabama Senate race. How 98% of Black women in the Black Belt state had turned out at the polls for Doug Jones and voted to protect the interests of their communities. Now, to the interest of the casual Twitter user, the conversation probably seemed pretty simple. Black women, part of a reliable Democratic voting bloc, had come out to do what they'd always done, vote in our own interests, and thus in the interest of those on the margins. But beyond that hashtag that trended on the day, roiled a series of conversations and debates about the roles that Black women play in maintaining civil society. Leslie McFadden, an activist and creator of the Ferguson Response Tumblr, may have said it best. When Black women went to the polls for Doug Jones, they didn't do it to save the nation. They did it to save themselves. For many Black women, and for people who study Black women through a Black feminist lens, the outcome was inevitable. As Patricia Hill Collins theorized nearly 30 years ago in her seminal work on Black feminist thought, the collective standpoint of Black women's knowledge and advocacy can be reliably called upon to work in the interest of social justice, not only for members of our own group, but for others disenfranchised by normative systems of oppression, including the law, economic policy, and media practices. As the hashtag Black Women trended on December 13th, 2017, it became a digital artifact that reflected the invisible influence of Black Twitter's community connections and networked communicative practices that have influenced social media discourse over the last 5 to 10 years. The use of a hashtag to shout out Black women for protecting our own interests in this race and in the 2016 presidential race is technocultural acknowledgement of the role of Black Twitter as an amorphous, socially constructed site of resistance discourse. Black Twitter is one space in which historically disenfranchised people are developing our own set of cultural values and filters for culturally competent reporting and information gathering and dissemination that may be applied to fulfill the charge of media's social responsibility for contributing to an informed and engaged citizenry. I would go so far as to say that centering these emergent values would help any creator of information systems contend with the perennial issues of dominance and subjugation by centering the perspectives of the vulnerable in their designs. While my work focuses on contemporary digital counternarratives, it's critical to note that these practices are nothing new. Zora Neale Hurston, writing about the signifying tradition of Black folks in her 1934 essay, Characteristics of Negro Expression, and I maintain the language, links the common understanding between the hushed whispers and knowing looks exchanged in physical Black enclaves, such as the beauty and the barbershop, sorority meetings, and of course, in our own homes, as well as in digital enclaves, the comment section of the Black blogosphere, and our digitized legacy publications like Ebony and Jet, and on social media platforms, including Facebook and my preferred site of inquiry, Twitter. Every phase of Negro life is highly dramatized, she wrote. And I have to wonder if prophetically she could see how her 21st century kin resist over-policing of Black bodies by recasting nosy women as Barbecue Becky and Permit Patty. Pithy, if problematic nicknames for those who believe that calling the police is standard procedure when one encounters Black people simply living their lives, especially when Black and Hispanic folks are 50% more likely to be subjected to non-lethal use of force, according to Roland Flyer's 2017 empirical analysis of such encounters. No matter how joyful or how sad the case, there is sufficient poise for drama, Hurston wrote. Everything is acted out. There is an impromptu ceremony always ready for every hour of life. No little moment passes unadorned. The drama that Hurston refers to is woven of vocal inflection, Black orality, expressive physicality, and it draws on shared experiences. It's gone by a number of names in days past. At its most basic level, it's the process of signifying, using coded, colorful language to render the oppressor powerless, to draw on definitions from Henry Louis Gates Jr. and the late folklorist Roger Abrams. But within Twitter, where semiotic expressions of Black culture meet the technological affordances of a social networking platform and the appetite of an audience that is always on, this drama yields what I call digital counternarratives. Interactive, multi-layered, transmutable texts that build on the raw materials of personal experience and culturally resonant symbols to allow a variety of online collaborators to construct intricate, cohesive social stories that run contradictory to the dominant frames of Black life encountered in mainstream media. I take particular interest in the ones that arise out of Black women's narrative theorizing, a sense-making process that begins with our recognition of how certain social factors, namely race, class, ability, and access, and gender, shape our social lived experiences. We process these observations, sharing them with others within our community to make sense of their commonalities, and render them as illustrative tales that are legendary within our own communities, and at least legible to members of outgroups. The affordances of the digital and ability to move beyond words and through the use of sound and visual images and affect in order to create cohesive narrative structures is critical to making the testimonies of Black women's liberation work translatable and accessible to wider audiences, even if it remains somewhat unpalatable. Digital counternarratives render the promise of the online news commons that media gatekeepers sought to create through online commenting into something that actually works, by providing perspectives that are otherwise shut out of public discourse. The creation of digital counternarratives betrays the benevolent belief that any one person, platform, or profession can provide a voice for the voiceless. Digital counternarratives amplify the din of marginalized voices that are often hushed because they intone with regional dialects or speech patterns, or use Black vernacular English, or dwell in spaces where few gatekeepers bother to invest in spending time to understand the norms that affect the lingua franca of marginalized communities. They exist as hashtags and catchphrases, cultural signifiers that complicate multiple embedded meanings through an amalgamation of personal and shared experiences, references to traditions and entertainment, and embodied knowledge. But they are also longer texts, captured through multiple tweet threads, blogs, memes, web videos, and banal conversations that unfold on social networking platforms and in digital media spaces every day. For example, the phrase Black Lives Matter is a 3-word digital counternarrative that performs several functions, from its inception as part of a love letter to grieving Black communities for whom justice in the face of extrajudicial, racially motivated violence is routinely denied, to its adaptation as a form of economic, political, and social critique that forces civic actors to consider how their beliefs, behaviors, and policies are built on an unfortunate racial binary that espouses whiteness as normative and Black existence as deviant. Black Lives Matter is just one counternarrative created by Black women that compounds the lenses of Black feminist thought and intersectional inquiry into a prism through which the complexities of our experiences can be translated to combat tired tropes about Black women, and also dangerous beliefs about Black men and mythology about Black communities. Digital counternarratives come in a variety of media, including print in the form of those pithy hashtags, and in first-person tweeted testimonies, and to also mobile phone video eyewitnessing. They work through a series of rhetorical and logistical moves, including visual juxtaposition and the indulgence of counterfactual scenarios that force factors of race, gender, and power into focus. They rely on a sense of temporality, layers of text, image and imagery, evocative language, reproducibility, invocation, public imagination, shared experience, cultural commonality, and in particular, the fact that they are not controlled by governing figures such as the Associated Press, in-house style guides, or newsroom norms. They do not conform to polite conventions. If you are a racist, a person who seeks to benefit from the power dynamics of heteropatriarchal white supremacy, Black Twitter will call you by your name. We will call the belief system that you profess or belie with your own mouth and the actions that proceed from it racist. Our ability to use the same communicative tools that allow crowds of people to connect with one another in the information age to demand truth from power is essential to the survival of truth when it comes under fire from forces of power. In the last year, when dog whistle politics characterized sensational stories and headlines, Black Twitter invoked its own trademark humor to cope with racial battle fatigue as news outlets stumbled over every possible combination of words to avoid labeling an action or statement as racist. A shooting was racially motivated. The rhetoric from a sitting president and a Senate leader were racially tinged. Until finally, the Associated Press gave its blessing for journalists to call racism by its name in the latest update to its annual AP style book, widely known as the Journalist's Bible. Black Twitter called those names long before the AP said it was okay to do so. The social media users whose conversations and perspectives are at the center of my work understand why we cannot wait for mainstream media to decide it would rather tell the truth than endure the threat of lawsuits. They recognize that the media's ideological role in shaping our definitions of race and the imagery that it carries, as Stuart Hall wrote, we live, as he said, the problem of race as constructed by the media. That when verbal slights against us by sitting politicians draw on structural inequalities and have the ability to contribute to policies that impact our communities negatively, and when the media fail to confront them, we recognize that they become complicit in capitalistic white supremacy, choosing the fear of legal repercussions that could lead to lower profit margins in order to offending the powerful while simultaneously assisting them in subjugating the other through the social construction of news. And so we speak. Building upon Black storytelling traditions, the obligation of Black intellectuals connected by a web of connective tools, our shared experiences, and our common cultural beliefs, is to tell the truths as we see them as mediated by race, to create digital counternarratives of how structural forces of power work in our everyday lives. I'm particularly interested in this work as it exists among Black women whom I've been studying in one way or another since I was a child. We're going to take you back a moment here. So I grew up as a preacher's kid, and our house was always full of people. If we weren't at church, we were at home with the people from church. Those church folks over the years became my fictive kin. People came over for Sunday dinner. After evening service, they came over for ice cream, and they stayed late into the summer nights. They dropped by while we were sick, and they came by to cheer for their favorite teams during our annual Super Bowl party. They are the people that I still call to this very day when my mother, recently widowed, still fairly independent, forgets to turn on her cell phone and cannot be reached. My favorite part, though, about the visits to our home were probably listening to the conversations that took place around the kitchen table. They're reminiscent of Jada Pinkett Smith's Facebook Red Table Talks, but they were missing that multi-generational approach because children in my mother's house were to be seen and not heard. The women in my community, in this network, would gather to talk about their lives, creating colorful narratives of their lived experiences and theorizing about mastery of the challenges set before them, these challenges of the workplace and the home. As a college student, I sought to recreate these dynamics, unaware at the time that I was participating in an oral tradition as long and as storied as the history of the people I claim. This process of narrative theorizing is an integral component in the production of Black feminist thought, which, as I referenced Patricia Hill Collins earlier, Patricia Hill Collins explained in her 1991 canonical volume on the subject. It has 6 characteristics. I don't assume that everyone is familiar with Black feminist thought, so I'm going to take a point of privilege to explain them. It first positions Black women in the United States as members of an oppressed group. It recognizes that while there is no one singular Black woman's experience, our collective experiences offer a standpoint for engaging and examining power relations from the perspectives of a subjugated group. It centers the alternative practices and bodies of situated knowledge that we have developed to foster group empowerment. It values the contributions of Black women intellectuals and demands that we must be of diverse ages, social classes, educational backgrounds, occupations, and the like. It demands that we ask the right questions and investigate multiple dimensions of Black women's standpoints with and for African American women. It is dynamic, and it adapts to complement the roles that Black women find themselves in society as those roles continue to change. It says that our knowledge, our sites of inquiry, and our sites of development must evolve as well. Black feminist thought must go into new places. It must go where Black women are and where we hope to be. and it recognizes that the strength and value imbued in sense of community must force us to maintain connections to social justice projects. In the spaces where Black women gather, be they kitchen tables, the workplace, sorority meetings, queer reading groups, or the like, our knowledge production flows without interruption of having to contextualize it within the white racial frame, the so-called view from nowhere that Joe Fegan describes as the invisibility of everyday white supremacy, a schema combining beliefs, cognition, affect, and actions that affirm and uplift whites while devaluing or negating or erasing Blacks or others through a series of frames and subframes. This identity is often considered as default by white individuals who see themselves and the way they move through the world simply as things are, instead of the outcome of a complex set of historically defined power relations. This conversation and its flows, uninterrupted, connected by Black women's stories, is also true and also unfolding on Twitter. In the mid-2000s, it became the platform of choice for the Black social media user, who outpaced every other social group on the networking site. In 2009 and 2010, it became the site of inquiry for journalists who wanted to know a little bit more about what Black people were doing on the internet. Within 6 years of the platform's development, Twitter would play a critical role in broadcasting Black women's discourse to the mainstream through conversations about the hypersexualization of teenage girls that undergird contemporary calls to mute R. Kelly, the coining of the term misogynoir, which recognizes the intersecting oppressions that Black women, specifically queer Black women, face along lines of race and gender, and the multivalent political concerns that drive our voting behavior. Black Twitter's structure and its process of Black digital resistance offer an explanation for the process of understanding how Black women are using our time-honored oral traditions and digital technologies to engage in racial uplift, reclaim our image from mass media depictions of Black womanhood, and draft intricate counternarratives that, if the principles that shape them were to be adapted by other creators, could allow us to create more equitable representation in media. Now, I came to the problem of seeing Black women's digital discourse as more than online chatter shortly before I began my doctoral education here in 2010. I was finishing my last days at the Tallahassee Democrat, and I see one of my old coworkers in the audience. And I came across a story from Slate magazine. And the headline on the story read, "How Black People Use Twitter." My first job in the news industry was as a copy editor. And so what I know about headlines is that headlines are designed to tell the story, even if a person doesn't read it. What's dangerous about a headline that says how Black people use Twitter is that it can convey to a person who isn't reading carefully or doesn't dig beyond the sources used for the story that this is how all Black people use Twitter. The story counted only Black media elites among its sources and focused on banal conversations about sexuality and fun, and totally missed the narratives that I saw unfolding every day about how news and policy were impacting Black lives. I was concerned about these messages being communicated about Black digital discourse. And so I stuck this story in my back pocket, and it became a text that I archived for use in courses about the art of ethnography and ethnography in Black communities, drawing on the work of Mary Padilla McCoy and John L. Johnson to consider class striations in public discourse, and also using Eric Lassiter's work on collaborative ethnography to preserve my participants' sense of agency and to inform my data collection practices. Since 2013, I have conducted in-depth interviews with about 100 people around their experiences building community, producing shared knowledge, and engaging in collective action while advocating for Black communities on Twitter. I also used, and continue to use, participant observation to engage in Black Twitter's online discourses, applying textual analysis to a series of news media texts, which I reconstruct along with my observations and interview data to make sense of the social construction of reality inside Black online communities, with respect to how our communities use, develop, and disseminate news and information online. I first developed a sense of Black Twitter's structure and function during its nascent years, specifically 2009 through 2014. Now, this consists of 3 levels of community connection, including personal communities, neighborhoods or thematic nodes, and the meta-network that unites the two. The idea of personal communities is a concept advanced by Barry Waldman, who holds that our online communities are reflective of our offline realities, specifically the social ties and values that govern our relationships with people with whom we choose to regularly interact in physical spaces. My initial participants told me that they joined Twitter because their friends were there. There was a certain group of them who told me, in fact, that they joined Twitter because they didn't want to use office IMs to gossip about their coworkers. Twitter provided another channel for socialization, including information gathering and sharing, and it also met their effective needs for companionship as they disclosed information about the detail of their offline lives. 2 of them told me it was a space for talking about their divorces because their family members were on Facebook and they didn't want to be surveilled. Once Twitter conversations between friends and friend groups began to overlap according to interest, engagement about dialogue about specific topics and frequency of use of the platform led to the development of what I call thematic nodes and what one of my participants called neighborhoods, a much better term. Rather than ad hoc publics that form for a short time around a single issue, Black Twitter's neighborhoods are defined by topics of interest and their related terminology, norms, and values. They differ in that their participants or residents recognize a sense of community structure built around a topic and actively identify as members of that community. These relationships are stronger than the weak social ties and bonds that are reified through discourse, collective action, and engagement. One of my participants told me that one of her neighborhoods was Blackademia. She said, "If you're Black and in a PhD program, you're going to get followed by me." I have a lot of academics who follow me as well. I didn't start out on Twitter thinking that's what I was going to use it for. I don't think any of us did. I think more academics started joining, and they started seeing me retweet, and they retweeted me, and we interacted. 5 years after that conversation, the development of hashtag conversations, Trinagrad, and Site flagged the digital counternarratives unfolding within the boundaries of this neighborhood, where Black students in graduate programs, recent graduates, and members of the academy gather to process our experiences in higher education. My own handle, Tenure Track Hustle, is another example. In 2018, it was adapted by Kishana Gray and Rashana Chappell for an article about the experiences of first-generation and low-income women of color in the academy. Each regular user of Twitter may identify as a resident of several neighborhoods. They're the spaces that we turn to as we maintain the construction of our shared social identities. They're the topics of interest that unite us on the platform, even when we are divided by generation, geography, and a host of other factors. Now, incidentally, I found it very interesting that Jack Dorsey, Twitter's co-founder and CEO, recently rolled out a plan to reorganize Twitter's algorithm in order to shift users away from people they follow and toward topics they like. Give me a call, Jack. When an incendiary event occurs, however, and this is something that can range from a racist or homophobic or transphobic remark from a well-known entertainer or politician, the broadcast of a popular television show, or the caught-on-tape assault of a young Black woman by a police officer, these neighborhoods and the personal communities that are comprised within them begin to interact, forming Black Twitter's meta-network. The meta-network is what most people, particularly those outside of Black Twitter, are referring to when they talk about Black Twitter. It's the coalescence of online interaction, replete with enough discursive power to impact Twitter's trending topics algorithm, generating enough online interest to allow information to spread from neighborhoods that have discussed the topic for years to personal communities that are being newly enlightened about the backstory of particular issues because of those conversations. The most salient and sustained example of the meta network and its power to use intertextual elements to steer discourse is, of course, the Black Lives Matter movement. Brooke, one of my participants in my research on the Black Lives Matter movement, described how connection to others provided support while dealing with collective grief in the wake of 2 years' worth of news reports about police assaults on Black Americans. In the midst of this despair, she said, there was a silver lining of community. It was different to experience it with this community, even though we weren't in the same space. Other participants spoke about how they used the BLM hashtag and ones that bore the name of slain victims to find protests in local areas after being forced to share their disappointment behind closed doors in the workplace, saying that Twitter provided the only comfort they could find. Their recognition and use of shared network connections on the platform are a demonstration of Black digital resistance, the strategic process of amplifying and elevating a multiplicity of Black voices in online discourse while performing the intellectual and emotional labor of being Black online. The process, I identify, happens in 6 stages. Identification, where people show up as Black and perform their race online, where in being Black online, you could be anyone, and Lisa Nakamura talks about the issue of racial tourism. Self-selecting into conversations, participation by using a specific hashtag or phrase, affirmation by speaking directly to one another or engaging in other direct ways, be these retweets or quote tweets, reaffirmation in taking these online conversations to offline spaces. And the example that I use is that when I moved to Charlottesville on August 13th, 2017, I had never seen so many Black Lives Matter signs in my life. And finally, vindication. The result of Black Twitter's conversations being translated into some measurable action, whether that's the loss of Paula Deen's endorsements or the loss of a book contract for juror B37 looking to profit off of the not guilty verdict in the Zimmerman trial, stopping a damaging show like Sorority Sisters, or indeed muting R. Kelly. I first traced this process in 2013 following George Zimmerman's acquittal for the murder of Trayvon Martin, when user Jeannie Lauren created an online petition to block a book deal for the juror in the case. She said, I felt weird about calling it online activism. It was cathartic for me because I felt like we did something positive. We could affect change. Zimmerman wasn't found guilty. Trayvon was still dead, but we stopped the book. When people call it online activism, I don't want to reject that. But at the same time, there were so many more bigger issues than a book. To put it in the same category, to call myself an online activist, I don't feel like I'm saying anything that anyone else couldn't do. We stopped the book. We did act. We did something that isn't changing the world. It's not changing a big institutional failure, but we did stop that book. I couldn't have done it without those people engaging me and amplifying my voice. Black Twitter is responsible for that. Black women on Twitter, working through their networks of personal communities and developing Black digital enclaves hidden in plain sight, have engaged in these digital resistance practices to interrogate mainstream media depictions of Black womanhood in a number of ways. Dana Chapman detailed one in her 2016 exploration of the online conversation around Scandal, the first primetime television show in nearly 40 years to have a Black woman as its lead character. Chapman drew attention to the way Black women engaged in dialogue about the politics of respectability, the burden of representation, and the rejection of tired tropes about Black womanhood and Black sexuality, creating for themselves an online forum where Black female representation was made and remade, echoing Stuart Hall's observation about Black popular culture, that it is a dynamic site where identities are always contested. Similar conversations surface again and again. Examples include the gaffes where mainstream media demonstrate they can't tell two black women apart, denigrate our appearance and call it cultural criticism, or attempt to erase the work of black women who have advocated for our communities for years. One example of this erasure is a lack of the credit paid to digital interlocutors who highlighted the hypersexualization and exploitation of black girls in 2014 during a coordinated conversation, #FastTailGirls. Now, I'll stop here just to make sure that we're all on board with the Southernisms. Being fast-tailed means that you are sexually advanced, sexually mature. It's something that black mamas and grandmamas and aunties use to keep black girls from performing any sort of form of sexuality as a protective mechanism. Jamie Nisbet Golden and Mickey Kendall, creators of the site Hood Feminism, used the conversation to talk through the many ways black women and girls are blamed for our own trauma. When I first decided to do it, Fast Tail Girls, Mickey Kendall said, we were having one of those what should girls do conversation. And I thought we should talk about the idea that girls should do whatever to earn respect. We have generations of women who have been victimized. 40 to 60% of black women before they reach 18, she said, will be the subject of an unwanted sexual encounter. We have to start talking about what that means. I now know that if you get on Twitter and you give people permission to speak with a hashtag, they will unclench. The wells of their souls will pour out. I have seen people confess their lives online, publicly. The Fast Tail Girls conversation highlighted how the criminal behavior of known predators like R&B star R. Kelly is dismissed and discounted by placing the onus on black girls. The conversation served as a space for self-disclosure and healing for a number of its participants, and the hashtag remains in use as a signifier of the complicated and often cold realities of being seen as a hypersexual being before you are physically, mentally, or emotionally mature. It's resurfaced most recently with the Surviving R. Kelly documentary that was produced by Dreamhampton. Another example of these digital counternarratives is the criminalization of black women and girls when we are the victims of public, mediated, and/or state violence. The hashtag #SayHerName, for instance, developed by Kimberly Crenshaw, who is best known for her work on critical race theory and coining the term intersectionality, the lens for interpreting experiences defined by oppression that fall along lines of race, gender, and class, was created by the work of the African American Policy Forum and designed as a narrative device used to draw attention to the erasure of black women who were also victims of state violence during the Black Lives Matter movement. As a report from the forum states, our goal is not to offer a comprehensive catalog of police violence against black women. Indeed, it would be impossible to do so, as there is currently no accurate data collection on police killings nationwide, no readily available database compiling a complete list of black women's lives lost at the hands of police, and no data collection on sexual or other forms of gender and sexuality-based police violence. Moreover, the media's exclusive focus on police violence against black men makes finding information about black women of all gender identities and sexualities much more difficult. Given these limitations, our goal is simply to illustrate the reality that black women are killed and violated by police with alarming regularity. Equally important, our hope is to call attention to all the ways in which this reality is erased from our demonstrations, our discourse, and our demands to broaden our vision of social justice. All of that in 3 words: say her name. When the women of Black Twitter use hashtags like #SayHerName or tell stories of black trans women whose lives and deaths would otherwise go unreported or reported in ways that disrespect their personhood, they are linking back to centuries-old legacies of mainstream media's misrepresentations and inaccuracies regarding black life in the United States. In 1827, Samuel Cornish and John Russwurm published the following opening salvo in Freedom's Journal, the first newspaper owned and operated by free black men in the United States. The peculiarities of this journal renders it important that we should advertise to the world our motives by which we are actuated and the objects which we contemplate. We wish to plead our own cause. Too long have others spoken for us. Too long has the public been deceived by misrepresentation in things which concern us dearly, though in the estimation of some mere trifles, for though there are many in society who exercise towards us benevolent feelings, still, with sorrow we confess it, there are others who make it their business to enlarge upon us the least trifle, which tends to discredit any person of color, and pronounce anathemas and denounce our whole body for the misconduct of this guilty one. More than 130 years later, as the nation's urban centers smoldered in the wake of riots towards the end of the civil rights movement, the impact of these misrepresentations were again measured by the Kerner Commission, an 11-member task force called together by President Lyndon B. Johnson to answer 3 questions about how the country fell into a series of civil disorders. They were charged with answering these 3 questions. What happened? Why did it happen? What can be done to stop it from happening again? The commission offered several chapters of advice for improvements, ranging from things for federal government to local law enforcement to mainstream mass media to improve the material conditions and public sense of social reality around Black communities. The commission warned that the country was moving toward becoming 2 Americas, one Black and one white, noting that a lack of meaningful integration and inclusion in mainstream media newsrooms contributed to the problems of inadequate and inaccurate coverage of Black communities. I can attest that this is true for my own hometown paper, the Lexington Herald-Leader, which in 2004 ran a mea culpa about its coverage of local demonstrations, a 22-word statement to address a critical failure in editorial judgment and political will. It has come to the editor's attention that the Herald-Leader neglected to cover the civil rights movement. We regret the omission. 10 years after the Kerner Report, in 1978, the American Society of Newspaper Editors, now known as the American Society of News Editors, and as of August, News Leaders of America, began to take an annual demographic census of the country's newspaper newsrooms, setting a goal of achieving racial parity with the communities these papers served by the year 2000. That goal was moved to 2025 in 1998, when it became apparent that the industry was nowhere near making its target. And as I am currently working on this project, I can tell you that the goalposts are moving yet again. As of 2018, all people of color make up only 13% of the newsroom industry as accounted for by the survey. All people of color, not just Black people, not just East Asians, South Asians, not just Latinx folks, all people of color. A similar survey conducted by RTDNA finds that people of color make up 24% of the TV news industry and 11% of journalists in radio. Operating within the confines of these mass media ecologies, whose enduring values were shaped in eras when Black people had not been afforded the equal protection of constitutional law, and working out of news outlets that gained traction in the golden era of print, when the Kerner Commission rightly acknowledged the discrepancies created through a lack of meaningful newsroom inclusion, the absence of Black voices in the newsroom has been linked to an overrepresentation of deviant existence and behavior within Black communities. In A Dangerous Distortion of Our Families, a report released by Color of Change in 2018, Travis Dixon, a professor at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, found that Black families represent 59% of the poor in news and opinion media, but make up just 27% of the poor in published reports. While white families represent 17% of the poor in news and opinion media, but make up 66% of the poor in published reports. And 37% of those represented as criminal in news and opinion media are Black family members, although Black family members constitute only 26% of family members arrested for criminal activity, according to crime reports, while 28% of those represented as criminal are white family members, though white family members constitute 77% of those arrested for criminal activity, according to crime reports. As we increasingly critique the role of mainstream mass media and its progeny, specialized digital media, we must also challenge the existing approaches that have failed to adequately serve diverse populations. Herbert Gans, the German sociologist whose 1979 report, Deciding What's News, made critique in that work and updated it again in 2011, but without the benefit of a critique informed by critical race theory, Black feminist thought, or emergent theories of technoculture. It's time for an update. Each time Black social media users engage in the process of Black digital resistance, our discourse creates a series of distinct counter-narratives to challenge the depictions of mainstream media's depictions of Black life. I draw on observation and critical interpretation of these practices to call for revisiting news media and other information system approaches by centering such work around Black feminist principles shaped in these spaces. To revisit Patricia Hill Collins' framework one more time, I consider this: how Black feminist thought fosters fundamental paradigmatic shift in how we think about unjust power relations, race, class, gender, sexuality, nation, individual, and collective agency. Black feminist thought is concerned with social relations of dominance and resistance. And thus I contend that vulnerability must be the locus for the development of a critical cultural approach to news gathering, filtering, and dissemination that enhances our understanding of what journalism and news media in particular can be, and what purpose information systems can serve for diverse audiences in the digital age. Black women's digital counter-narratives are not just compelling objects of study for media sociology or cultural critique. I privilege Black women in my work and encourage others to do the same because our existence is predicated on the very vulnerabilities that historically journalism as an act of social responsibility, and more recently, humanistic commitments to open access and information systems were designed to address. When we recall that Black women are women, and that Black women are disabled women, immigrant women, trans women, and poor women, we realize that we exist at every point of human vulnerability that can be called by name. We will better understand how and why the situated knowledges of Black women hold significant capacity for moving the margin to the center, thus improving conditions of access for all. Our perspectives are critical tools in maximizing the potential of information for social good, allowing creative workers to design inclusive, responsive, and effective systems for the public. Although it was a contentious debate in my classroom this term, I agree with and paraphrase Black Lives Matter co-founder Alicia Garza when she says that when Black women get free, everyone will be free. I offer that Black women, particularly within Black Twitter, have and continue to create ecologies within our network that show how vulnerable groups can reclaim their representation in news and entertainment media and in information systems. How we can create digital, multi-perspectival counter-narratives that more accurately reflect the reality of the lived experiences of the vulnerable. Now, don't get it twisted. I am not saying that Black women will save us all. We are not mammy figures, nor are we people for whom intellectual capacity is rendered to the public sphere. That's not our job, and frankly, we're still waiting to be properly compensated for centuries of unpaid labor. To address Dr. Brittany Cooper's call for Black women scholars to advance the work of Black feminist theorists in the pre- and early internet eras into the digital age, I joined this work in conversation with academics including Moya Bailey, Sarah J. Jackson, Sophia Noble, and unaffiliated intellectuals, including Inasa Crockett, Shafika Hudson, and Trudy, among others, and Feminista Jones, among others, and argue that the digital discursive practices of Black Twitter's actors across a series of high-profile incidents and everyday banal conversations represent strategic negotiation of access, technological affordances, media literacy, and cultural competency in the creation of Black counter-narratives. I take on Cooper's questions, shifting it from their historical and literary origins when she asks, what, for instance, is a Black feminist account of freedom? What is a Black feminist account of justice? What is a Black feminist account of Black life? Specifically, I ask this audience, what can we learn from the examples of Black women's digital counter-narratives to reflect, rebuild, and reimagine both our informal and formal approaches to media as a tool for constructing shared social realities? When we place these questions at the center of our inquiry, our analyses, and our praxis, I believe that we will find what it means to maximize the potential of information for social good. Thank you.